In the heart of the city's judicial district, a grand, historic courthouse stood tall, its imposing columns and aged stone architecture reflecting years of history, justice, and sometimes hidden prejudice. Today, the courtroom within was packed to capacity. Reporters, relatives of the accused, and curious onlookers filled the rows, their eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom, where the trial of Julia Harris was about to commence. At the front, behind a polished mahogany bench, sat Judge Robert Langston, a man well known for his stern demeanor and unforgiving rulings. His reputation for upholding the law was as solid as the courtroom moles around him, but it was also whispered among the city's attorneys that Judge Langston had his own biases, ones he rarely concealed. Dressed impeccably in a dark robe, his glasses hung on a gold chain around his neck, and his gaze was sharp, cold, and devoid of sympathy as he looked out over the room. In the defendant's chair sat Julia Harris, a woman of quiet grace and unshakable confidence. She was a striking figure, her posture calm, yet somehow conveying a strength that seemed to transcend the courtroom itself. Julia was a black woman in her late 30s, with smooth, dark skin, high cheekbones, and a presence that demanded respect even in a place designed to strip defendants of their dignity. Her modest black business suit was neatly pressed, her long hair tied back, and a simple silver necklace rested just above her collarbone. Despite the gravity of her situation, her expression remained calm, as if she knew something no one else in the room did. The court buzzed with whispers and murmurs. Many of the onlookers sensed that there was something unusual about the trial, though they couldn't quite put their finger on it. The charge against Julia seemed trivial, a public disturbance in a high-end store downtown, with accusations of disorderly conduct and rudeness. Normally, such a minor offense wouldn't have even reached trial. But under Judge Langston's ruling, it had not only reached trial, it had become a spectacle. As the judge prepared to begin the session, he glanced briefly at Julia, but his gaze quickly returned to his notes. He addressed her by her last name, Miss Harris, his voice flat and laced with an unmistakable hint of disdain. The court has gathered here today to address the charges of public disturbance and disrespect of societal norms that you have allegedly violated, he began, his voice carrying an edge of authority that brooked no argument. Julia raised her chin slightly, a gesture not of defiance, but of quiet confidence. She'd expected this demeanor from the judge, and as he read her charges, she felt a familiar sense of disappointment, a feeling she'd experienced her entire life when facing individuals who judged her based on her skin rather than her character. To his left stood the prosecutor, a young, ambitious man eager to make a name for himself. He adjusted his tie and approached the podium with a practiced stride. Your Honor, the defendant, Ms. Harris, created a disruption at one of the most respected establishments in our city, behaving in a way that was uncivilized, he said, choosing his words carefully, yet with a tone that made his intent clear. She was observed raising her voice, challenging store employees, and causing discomfort to the patrons present. Julia's expression remained steady, though the words stung. She knew exactly what had happened that day. She'd gone to the store to return a dress, a gift that had been the wrong size. But when she arrived, the store employees had ignored her, allowing other customers to go ahead of her in line, despite her polite attempts to get their attention. After waiting for nearly an hour, she had finally spoken up, firmly but politely, only to be told that her attitude was unwelcome and that she should come back when she could be more civil. The prosecutor called the first witness, a young store clerk. She approached the stand, her gaze avoiding Julia's. Her testimony was hesitant, clearly rehearsed, and lacking any real substance. She raised her voice, and it made the other customers uncomfortable. The clerk said, her words faltering. The prosecutor prompted her. Isn't it true that her tone was aggressive? The clerk glanced at him, then nodded. Yes, it was aggressive, she repeated, though the doubt was evident in her eyes. Julia's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a calm yet firm demeanor, objected. Objection, Your Honor. The witness's statement is vague at best, and there is no evidence that Ms. Harris's actions disrupted the store's operations. But Judge Langston barely glanced up. Overruled, he said dismissively. The witness may continue. Julia's lawyer, Mr. Randolph, sat back, his jaw set tightly. He'd seen this scenario play out before. Witnesses whose words were manipulated to fit the narrative, judges who leaned in favor of the prosecution, and defendants, particularly black defendants, who found themselves unfairly cornered. He leaned over and whispered to Julia, "Stay calm. Don't let them provoke you." Julia nodded, her gaze fixed on the judge, as he motioned for the next witness. The second witness was another employee, a middle-aged man who spoke in an exaggerated manner, clearly embellishing the incident. She was confrontational, he said, his eyes flicking over to Julia with a mixture of fear and disdain. She kept insisting that she had the right to be served. It was disruptive, to say the least. Julia wanted to speak up, to tell the court that she'd merely asked to be treated with respect, but she knew that her words would fall on deaf ears. Each time she tried to speak during the trial, Judge Langston had interrupted, dismissing her statements as irrelevant. Her lawyer, determined to counter the biased testimonies, rose to cross-examine the witness. "So, Mr. Fielding," he began, "you claim that Ms. Harris's tone was disruptive. Can you recall exactly what she said?" The witness hesitated. "I don't remember the exact words, but it was her tone, you see. It was demanding." Randolph pressed further. Demanding, or simply asking for fair treatment? Before the witness could answer, Judge Langston's voice cut through the courtroom. "Mr. Randolph, please refrain from leading the witness," he said sharply, his glare making it clear that he would tolerate no further challenges to the testimonies. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker. Julia could feel the eyes of the spectators on her, some curious, others sympathetic, and still others judgmental. She took a steadying breath, her hands resting calmly on her lap. She'd been through moments like this before, times when she had been treated as if her existence itself was a challenge to the status quo. But today, standing accused in this solemn hall of justice, the unfairness was sharper, more cutting. Judge Langston turned his gaze back to Julia. His face hardened, as if he were already preparing to pronounce her guilty. "Ms. Harris," he began, his voice cold, "I have to say, your behavior is unbecoming and disturbing. It is individuals like you who challenge the fabric of decency in our society." Julia's heart clenched at his words, but she remained outwardly calm. She could see the barely concealed bias in his gaze, the disdain that simmered beneath his stern facade. His words weren't just aimed at her actions, they were aimed at her existence. The judge continued, "We live in a society of rules and decorum, and it is essential that we respect these boundaries. Your actions, as described by the witnesses, show a blatant disregard for this respect." Her lawyer attempted to interject. "Your Honor, I must object to these assumptions. The defense has not had an adequate opportunity to." But Judge Langston silenced him with a raised hand. "Enough, Mr. Randolph. I will not have this court devolve into chaos. The evidence speaks for itself." Julia held her head high, refusing to let the judge see her anger. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. Instead, she met his gaze with a steady resolve, her calmness defiant against his thinly veiled contempt. Seeing that she would not break, Judge Langston's voice grew sharper. "I find it necessary to make an example in cases such as this. Individuals who believe they are above the rules must learn their place." The court was silent, the weight of his words echoing ominously. It was clear to everyone present that the judge's verdict was a foregone conclusion. Julia could feel the judgment hanging over her, but she remained undeterred. Finally, Judge Langston leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I will deliver my final decision at the next hearing. Ms. Harris, you would do well to reflect on your actions and consider the importance of humility in society." With that, he rose, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. As he strode out of the courtroom, Julia remained seated for a moment, gathering her thoughts, her mind already steeling itself for what was to come. When she finally stood, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, some pitying, others hostile, but she ignored them all. Her calm expression never faltered as she walked down the aisle, her posture unwavering. She knew that justice might be out of reach in this courtroom, but she also knew that this fight was far from over. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the courthouse steps. Julia stood for a moment, taking a deep breath as the cool evening breeze washed over her. Her lawyer joined her, looking exhausted and frustrated. "I'm sorry, Julia," he said quietly. "I'll do everything I can, but Judge Langston has made up his mind. It's clear he has no intention of giving you a fair trial." Julia nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Randolph. But don't worry, I have faith that the truth will come out." As she stepped into her car, her calm exterior hid a storm of emotions. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that she had something on her side that the judge could never anticipate. Someone, in fact, whose mere presence would shake the very foundation of his beliefs and force him to confront his own biases. Little did Judge Langston know that the man he was about to sentence Julia in front of was none other than her husband, someone with power and influence that went beyond the walls of the courtroom, someone who would make sure that justice was not only served, but also redefined in a way that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. The next day dawned overcast, and the usual morning bustle surrounded the courthouse. Reporters and journalists gathered early, sensing that today's continuation of Julia Harris's trial would be anything but ordinary. Whispers floated through the crowd about who Julia was and why her trial had become such a spectacle for such a minor offense. The courthouse steps filled with curious onlookers, all drawn by the rumors circulating about this mysterious woman who stood her ground against the notorious Judge Robert Langston. Inside the courthouse, Julia's lawyer, Thomas Randolph, paced the hallway outside the courtroom. He was visibly tense, running over his notes and mentally preparing for the likely uphill battle. Although Julia's case was straightforward, Judge Langston's attitude had made it clear that he intended to issue a severe sentence, likely more severe than any previous cases of this nature. As he waited, Randolph heard murmurs from the crowd gathering outside the courtroom door, speaking in hushed tones about Julia's background. "Did you hear? She's married to someone powerful," whispered one man to his companion. "I heard he's someone big in politics," replied another. "Maybe a senator." Randolph could hear bits and pieces of speculation, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. His client's life and freedom were at stake, and he needed every ounce of focus and clarity he could muster. When Julia arrived, she moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, her calm demeanor commanding respect even from those who didn't know her. Today, she was dressed in a deep blue suit, her hair pinned neatly back, her expression as composed as ever. She acknowledged her lawyer with a nod, and together they made their way toward the courtroom. "Julia," Randolph said in a low voice, his face clouded with concern, "we're up against a tough opponent here. Judge Langston's prejudice is evident. I'll do everything I can, but—" Julia placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him mid-sentence. "Thomas, I appreciate your efforts. I know this isn't an easy battle, but believe me when I say I'm ready. I've faced prejudice all my life. Today is just another chapter. Justice will find its way, one way or another." Randolph nodded, slightly reassured by her calm determination, but he couldn't ignore the heaviness in his own heart. He knew that a biased verdict today could mean significant consequences for Julia, possibly even jail time. The courtroom filled quickly, with spectators crowding every available seat. The air was thick with anticipation as Judge Langston entered, his robe billowing behind him as he strode to the bench. The courtroom fell silent as he adjusted his glasses, his gaze scanning the room before settling on Julia. His expression was cold, his mouth set in a hard line, and there was a faint sneer in his eyes as he looked at her. The trial resumed with the prosecutor, a young man named Aaron Voss, presenting his case once more. He spoke with conviction, painting Julia's actions as a disruption to societal order, a blatant disregard for the rules of civility. He emphasized her uncooperative attitude and implied that her demeanor alone was a challenge to authority. "Your Honor," Voss said, turning to the judge with an ingratiating smile. Ms. Harris's actions were not only inappropriate, but posed a threat to the harmony of our community. Her tone, her behavior, all of it shows a disregard for respect and decorum. This type of behavior cannot be tolerated. Judge Langston nodded approvingly, his gaze flicking to Julia with a look of disdain. "Quite right, Mr. Voss. This court has no patience for those who challenge the values we uphold. Ms. Harris, your arrogance and disrespect have not gone unnoticed." Julia's lawyer, Randolph, rose to present her side. "Your Honor," he began, keeping his tone calm and professional, "the evidence here is insubstantial. The witnesses cannot recall specific actions or words that justify these charges. My client merely asked to be treated with respect, something we all have a right to expect." The judge's face darkened, and he interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Randolph, that your client is somehow above the law? That her actions were justified because she felt disrespected?" Randolph held his ground. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm merely pointing out that the charges against Ms. Harris are based on hearsay and unsubstantiated claims. No evidence has been provided to suggest she did anything other than assert her right to be treated fairly." The judge leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Randolph. "Mr. Randolph, this court doesn't appreciate lectures on fairness. This is not a debate on social etiquette. We are here to discuss the defendant's lack of respect for our community standards." Julia watched the proceedings in silence, her gaze unwavering as she observed the judge's bias on full display. She knew that this trial had little to do with her actions and everything to do with his perception of her. But she was prepared to face it, to endure whatever came her way. She was not here to simply defend herself. She was here to stand as a testament to her dignity, her resilience, and the truth. When it was Julia's turn to speak, Judge Langston fixed her with a piercing glare. "Ms. Harris," he said, his voice cold and calculating, "do you have anything to say in your defense? This is your chance to explain your actions, though I'm not sure there's much you could say that would change the facts." Julia rose, meeting his gaze calmly. "Your Honor, I do not deny that I spoke firmly that day. But I spoke firmly only after being ignored and disrespected repeatedly. All I wanted was to return a simple item, something that should have taken only a few minutes. But instead, I was disregarded, passed over, and treated as if my presence was a nuisance." Judge Langston's expression hardened, and he leaned forward, his tone accusatory. "And you believe that justifies disrupting a business and causing discomfort to others?" Julia held her head high, her voice steady. "I believe that every person, regardless of their background, deserves to be treated with basic respect. When that respect is denied, when people are made to feel small and invisible, sometimes a firm voice is the only tool left." The judge's eyes flashed with anger. "This courtroom is not the place for lectures on respect. Ms. Harris, your self-righteousness does you no favors here." But Julia remained unshaken. "Your Honor, I am not here to make myself small for your benefit or anyone else's. I am here to assert my right to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected." The spectators held their breath, the tension in the room growing thick. Judge Langston seemed visibly incensed, his face red with barely restrained anger. "Enough," he said, his voice barely more than a growl. "Ms. Harris, I have no patience for your posturing. I will not tolerate anyone who attempts to undermine the principles of this courtroom." He turned to the prosecutor, clearly intent on proceeding with a harsh sentence. "Mr. Voss, I believe we've heard enough. The evidence is clear, and it's time we restore order." Before he could continue, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heads turned as a tall, distinguished-looking man entered the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his bearing dignified and calm, with a quiet authority that seemed to fill the room. Judge Langston paused, his expression flickering with irritation at the interruption. "Who is this?" "This courtroom is in session." The man walked with measured steps toward the defense table, his eyes focused intently on Julia. When he reached her side, he extended a hand, which she took gratefully, though her own expression betrayed little surprise at his presence. It was as though she had been expecting him all along. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice carrying a note of quiet strength, "my name is Robert Hayes. I am Miss Harris's husband." The revelation rippled through the courtroom, and whispers broke out among the spectators. Judge Langston's face froze, and his mouth opened slightly in shock. Robert Hayes was not just any man. He was one of the most respected and influential figures in the community, a renowned philanthropist, and a successful entrepreneur with connections that reached far beyond the city's borders. The judge cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Hayes, I was not aware of your association with Miss Harris." Robert's gaze remained calm, unyielding. "Perhaps that is part of the issue, Your Honor. My wife has been subjected to a trial based on biases, assumptions, and a lack of evidence. Her character has been questioned in this courtroom, yet no substantial proof has been provided to support these charges." Judge Langston struggled to regain his composure. "Mr. Hayes, I assure you, this court adheres to the highest standards of justice. We do not allow influence or reputation to sway our decisions." Robert raised an eyebrow, his voice cool. "And yet, I see my wife being treated with a level of disdain that has no basis in law or justice." Julia watched her husband with a quiet strength, feeling a deep sense of pride and gratitude. Robert was not only standing up for her, he was challenging an entire system of bias and prejudice that had cast its shadow over this trial. Judge Langston shifted uncomfortably, his authority suddenly seeming less absolute. He realized that this trial, which he'd hoped would be a straightforward display of his control, had just taken an unexpected turn. "Your Honor," Robert continued, his voice calm but firm, "I would ask that the court reevaluate the evidence, or lack thereof, in this case. My wife deserves a fair hearing, free from the influence of bias." The judge's face reddened, but he could no longer ignore the influence of the man standing before him. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on this confrontation between power and integrity. "We will adjourn until tomorrow," Judge Langston announced, his voice barely masking his frustration. He gave one last icy glance at Julia and her husband before he exited the courtroom, his departure marked by a tense silence that hung in the air. As they left the courthouse, Julia and Robert walked side by side, their hands entwined. Despite the challenges ahead, Julia felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew that Robert's presence had shifted something profound in that courtroom, and she was determined to see this fight for justice through to the end. Outside, reporters flocked to them, their cameras flashing, their questions echoing through the air. But Julia ignored them, her focus solely on the path forward. She knew this was only the beginning, and with Robert by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The day after Robert's unexpected entrance, the courtroom atmosphere was charged with even more anticipation. Reporters gathered early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the power couple and perhaps even snag a few words before the trial resumed. The news of Robert Hayes' appearance had spread like wildfire, his reputation as a respected philanthropist and influential businessman amplifying the public's interest in what was supposed to be a simple case. The situation had evolved from a minor disturbance trial to a symbolic battle for justice and equality. Inside the courthouse, Julia and Robert arrived together, their presence exuding a quiet strength that resonated with those watching. Julia's calm resolve seemed almost unbreakable, but today, with Robert's unwavering support, her confidence shone even more brightly. He stood beside her, his arm resting protectively on her shoulder, his face set in an expression that was both determined and reassuring. Thomas Randolph, Julia's lawyer, joined them just outside the courtroom, greeting Robert with a firm handshake. "Mr. Hayes, I want to thank you for stepping in yesterday. Your support has made a tremendous difference, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Robert nodded. Julia deserves justice, and I intend to ensure she gets it, he replied, his tone resolute. Thank you, Mr. Randolph, for standing by her side. Julia placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. Thomas has been with me from the beginning, and I couldn't ask for a better advocate, she said, giving her lawyer a small, encouraging smile. She knew that despite his experience, even Randolph was feeling the weight of Judge Langston's unyielding bias. As they entered the courtroom, all eyes turned to them. The tension in the air was palpable as Julia and Robert took their seats, with Randolph positioning himself beside them, ready for another day of intense scrutiny. At the front of the room, Judge Langston sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable but his posture rigid. It was clear that he was displeased by Robert's intervention, though he attempted to mask his annoyance with a thin veneer of judicial detachment. The session began with the prosecutor, Aaron Voss, resuming his opening statements, clearly intending to reinforce the accusations. He spoke passionately, using every trick in the book to paint Julia's actions as a threat to societal order. But this time, the audience seemed less captivated. With Robert's presence in the courtroom, the prosecutor's words felt forced, as if he were grasping at straws to support a flimsy narrative. Your Honor, Voss declared, the defendant's actions were not only disruptive but demonstrated a blatant disregard for authority and respect. This isn't just about a single incident. It's about protecting the dignity of our public spaces and holding individuals accountable for behavior that undermines that dignity. Randolph rose, his expression calm but determined. With all due respect, Your Honor, my client merely spoke up after being repeatedly ignored. There is no evidence to support these exaggerated claims of disruption. We have yet to see any solid proof beyond vague testimonies. Judge Langston's gaze hardened, but before he could interrupt, Randolph pressed forward. In fact, Your Honor, I would like to call into question the motivation behind these charges. It's unusual, to say the least, that a minor disturbance would escalate to a full trial in this courtroom. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience as Randolph's words sank in. The onlookers began to realize what many had suspected. This trial was not about a single incident in a store. It was about something much deeper, something unsettling that lingered beneath the surface. Judge Langston cleared his throat, his voice taut. Mr. Randolph, I will not tolerate insinuations regarding this court's integrity. The law applies equally to all, and I am here to uphold it, regardless of personal connections or influence. Randolph met the judge's gaze without flinching. I am merely asking for the same level of fairness that any citizen should expect, Your Honor. Nothing more, nothing less. The judge's face tightened, but he said nothing, gesturing instead for the prosecutor to continue. Voss brought another witness to the stand, one of the store employees who had testified the previous day. This time, however, the witness seemed less certain, stumbling over her words and avoiding eye contact with the defense. Ms. Davidson, Randolph began during cross-examination, his voice measured and firm, you stated yesterday that Ms. Harris was disruptive and aggressive. Can you provide specific examples of her words or actions that fit these descriptions? The witness hesitated, glancing nervously at Judge Langston, and then at Voss, who nodded encouragingly. Well, she raised her voice, and she insisted on being served, Ms. Davidson said, her voice faltering. Is it accurate to say that she asked, not demanded, but asked to be treated fairly? Randolph asked, emphasizing his words carefully. Yes. I suppose so, the witness admitted, her discomfort evident. Randolph nodded, his tone gentle but persistent. Thank you, Ms. Davidson. Now, did Ms. Harris at any point use inappropriate language, or did she threaten anyone in the store? No, she didn't, the witness replied, barely above a whisper. Randolph turned to the judge, his expression resolute. Your Honor, there is no substantial evidence that my client's behavior was anything other than a firm request for respect. This trial is based on perception, not on proof of any misconduct. Judge Langston's face grew redder, but before he could speak, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened once more. Heads turned as a group of people entered, local activists, prominent figures from the community, and even a few members of the press who had managed to secure seats inside. Their presence was a show of solidarity, a silent statement against the injustice they perceived in this courtroom. The judge's gaze hardened as he watched the newcomers file in, taking their seats. He clearly understood the weight of this unexpected support for Julia, but his pride and his position would not allow him to relent. After a brief pause, he resumed his stern gaze, his voice a sharp command. "Order in the court. We will not be distracted by theatrics." But the courtroom was charged with a new energy. The presence of the supporters seemed to buoy Julia's spirits, giving her a renewed sense of determination. She knew that this trial was no longer just about her. It had become a symbol of resistance against bias and prejudice. The judge turned his attention to Julia. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice cold, "I am giving you one final opportunity to explain yourself. Do you wish to say anything to this court before I make my ruling?" Julia rose, her gaze steady as she looked directly at him. She took a deep breath, her voice calm yet filled with quiet strength. "Your Honor, I've spent my entire life being judged not for my actions, but for my appearance. I know that my presence in that store challenged the expectations of some people, but all I asked for was respect. I didn't raise my voice out of anger, but out of a need to be heard." Her words resonated through the courtroom, and the spectators listened intently. Julia continued, her voice unwavering. "I understand that rules are important, but those rules should apply equally to everyone. When they don't, they become tools of oppression. I am not here to defy the law. I am here to stand up for the dignity that every human being deserves." Judge Langston's expression remained impassive, but his grip on his gavel tightened. He appeared as though he was about to cut her off, but she held his gaze, refusing to be silenced. At that moment, Robert rose from his seat beside her, his face calm but his presence radiating authority. "Your Honor, I am here not only as Julia's husband, but as a citizen of this community. I ask that you consider her words and recognize that this case is about more than a minor disturbance. It's about justice, fairness, and the right of every person to be treated with respect." The judge looked visibly uncomfortable. Robert's influence was undeniable, and Judge Langston seemed caught between his desire to assert his authority and his growing awareness that his bias was on full display before a captivated audience. With a forced calm, he addressed Robert. "Mr. Hayes, this court does not respond to public opinion or personal influence. I must make my ruling based on the facts presented." Robert nodded, his voice unwavering. "Then, Your Honor, consider this. The facts show that my wife did nothing more than ask to be acknowledged, to be seen as equal to everyone else in that store. The real disruption here isn't her behavior, it's the prejudice she encountered. Prejudice that has, unfortunately, extended into this very courtroom." The spectators murmured in agreement, their whispers filling the silence that followed Robert's statement. Judge Langston looked around, his face flushed with a mix of anger and frustration. His grip tightened on the gavel as he tried to regain control of the proceedings. "Enough," he snapped, his voice echoing through the room. "This court does not cater to social commentary. Ms. Harris, you are accused of disrupting public order, and I intend to make an example of individuals who believe they are above the law." Julia's calm demeanor didn't waver. She knew that his words were meant to provoke her, to paint her as defiant and disrespectful, but she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, she met his gaze with a quiet strength, her silence speaking volumes. Realizing that he could not shake her, Judge Langston finally leaned back, his expression grim. "The court will adjourn for today. I will deliver my final ruling tomorrow morning." As he banged the gavel, signaling the end of the session, the crowd rose in near silence, a palpable tension filling the air. Julia and Robert exited the courtroom with their heads held high, surrounded by supporters who quietly followed them, their presence a powerful reminder that Julia was not alone in her fight for justice. Outside, a swarm of reporters awaited them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. But Julia and Robert kept walking, their hands intertwined, their focus unwavering. This was not a spectacle for them. It was a journey toward justice, and they knew that the next day would be pivotal. Back at home, as they prepared for the day ahead, Julia and Robert spoke quietly, their voices carrying the weight of hope and determination. They knew that tomorrow's verdict would set a precedent, not just for Julia, but for countless others who faced similar battles. And together, they were ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that they had done everything in their power to fight for what was right. The following morning, an air of anticipation thickened over the courthouse, drawing in an even larger crowd than the previous days. Word had spread rapidly, and the public was captivated by Julia Harris's trial, a trial that had quickly transformed into a symbol of standing up to prejudice within the justice system. People from all walks of life gathered outside, holding signs with words like "Justice for all" and "Equality matters." Journalists, activists, and community leaders had come to bear witness, each hoping to see fairness prevail. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Julia and Robert entered together, their hands intertwined, exuding a quiet strength that had become a source of inspiration for those following the case. Julia's lawyer, Thomas Randolph, joined them, his face resolute as he prepared for what would likely be the most crucial day of his career. He knew Judge Langston's decision would reveal more than just a verdict. It would be a testament to the integrity of the legal system itself. As they took their seats, a ripple of support flowed through the crowd in the courtroom. Community members who had come to witness the trial nodded respectfully at Julia and Robert. They had seen what this trial had become. More than just a judgment of guilt or innocence, it had become a referendum on how society treats people based on their background, race, and status. Shortly after, Judge Langston entered, his face set in an expression of steely resolve. He didn't acknowledge the packed courtroom or the palpable tension in the air. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and sat behind the bench, straightening his robe with an air of finality. He was a man clearly used to being in control, and the last few days had tested his authority in ways he hadn't anticipated. The prosecutor, Aaron Voss, stood confidently, sensing that the judge's verdict was leaning in his favor. He was eager to conclude the case, knowing that it could bolster his career and reputation. However, despite his confidence, even he seemed slightly rattled by the unusual attention and scrutiny the case had garnered. "Before I announce my ruling," Judge Langston began, his voice echoing through the courtroom, "I would like to remind everyone present that this court operates under the principles of law and order. This is not a forum for social commentary or emotional appeals. My role here is to uphold the law without bias or favoritism." Julia's face remained calm, though her jaw tightened slightly at his words. She knew those remarks were meant to dismiss the outpouring of support she'd received from the public. It was clear that Judge Langston wanted to appear impartial, yet his words revealed a deep-seated discomfort with the support for Julia that had flooded the courtroom. The judge continued, his gaze shifting briefly to Julia before looking out over the room. "The charges against Ms. Harris are based on behavior that disrupted the public order. I will not allow this courtroom to be swayed by personal influence or public opinion. The law applies to all." Randolph leaned toward Julia, whispering, "He's still posturing, but stay calm. We've prepared for this." Julia nodded, grounding herself in the strength that came from knowing she had spoken her truth. Beside her, Robert sat resolutely, his face calm but his eyes keenly observing every word, every movement from the judge. Without further delay, the judge continued. "The evidence presented by the prosecution shows that Ms. Harris's behavior in the store was disruptive and caused discomfort to others. However," he paused, and a tense silence filled the room. "The testimony provided lacked specifics. While there was mention of a raised voice, No concrete evidence was provided to suggest any threat or aggression beyond a request for service. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Julia's supporters leaned forward, listening intently, while the prosecutor's confident expression faltered. Voss shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in the judge's tone. Judge Langston's gaze grew colder as he turned his attention back to Julia. "Ms. Harris," he said, his voice carrying an edge, "while the lack of specific evidence does complicate this case, it is nonetheless clear to me that your conduct was not exemplary. Your behavior, whether or not disruptive, was inappropriate for the setting in which it occurred. Such behavior erodes the decorum we value in our society." Julia met his gaze with a steady, unflinching look. She understood that for Judge Langston, this case was not just about the law. It was about his perception of what was appropriate and his discomfort with her presence. He was determined to deliver some form of rebuke, even if the evidence did not support a harsh sentence. But before he could continue, Robert rose from his seat, his tall frame exuding an air of quiet authority. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured but firm, "may I address the court?" The judge looked taken aback. He hesitated, clearly displeased with the interruption, but unable to deny Robert's influence and standing in the community. After a brief pause, he nodded, though his expression remained stern. "Proceed, Mr. Hayes, but be brief," the judge said, his voice tight. Robert nodded, his gaze unwavering as he spoke. "Thank you, Your Honor. I stand here not only as Julia's husband, but as a citizen who believes deeply in the principles of justice. I understand and respect the importance of order and decorum, but I must remind this court that justice is more than adherence to superficial standards. True justice is about ensuring that every person is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background." He continued, his words clear and resonant. Julia's actions in that store were not disruptive. They were a response to being ignored, marginalized, and dismissed, experiences that, unfortunately, are not uncommon for people who look like her. She asked for nothing more than to be treated as an equal. If such a request is considered disruptive, then perhaps it is not her behavior that needs reevaluation, but our understanding of fairness. The audience remained silent, hanging on every word. Randolph, sitting beside Julia, felt a surge of admiration for Robert's eloquence. Julia, too, felt an overwhelming sense of pride as her husband spoke, standing up for her and for the principles they both held dear. Judge Langston's face flushed, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Mr. Hayes," he said icily, "I must remind you that this court is not a platform for speeches. This case is about your wife's conduct, not broader societal issues." Robert's eyes met the judge's, a subtle defiance in his calm gaze. "With respect, Your Honor, my wife's conduct cannot be divorced from the context in which it occurred. To ignore that context is to deny her the fair treatment she deserves." The judge opened his mouth, clearly prepared to issue a reprimand. But the murmurs in the courtroom, supportive, low voices in agreement with Robert, made him hesitate. He could feel the pressure mounting, the public scrutiny weighing on him. And though his pride resisted, he realized he could no longer ignore the implications of his bias. Judge Langston took a deep breath, straightening in his chair. "Very well, Mr. Hayes. Your point has been made. However, I remain committed to upholding the standards of this court." The prosecutor, sensing the judge's discomfort, quickly intervened. "Your Honor, may I propose a compromise? Given the lack of specific evidence, perhaps a minimal penalty, a warning, at the very least, would be appropriate. It would serve as a reminder of the importance of proper behavior in public spaces." Randolph immediately rose, his voice firm. "Your Honor, my client has already faced humiliation and unwarranted scrutiny. A warning, even a minor penalty, would be an admission of guilt she does not deserve. Ms. Harris has done nothing more than assert her right to equal treatment, a right that should not be punished in any form." Judge Langston looked visibly torn. He had entered this trial expecting to deliver a swift rebuke, But the growing pressure from the audience, the media, and now from the high-profile presence of Robert Hayes, had complicated his intentions. His pride demanded that he retain control, yet his authority felt increasingly undermined. After a moment of silence, he sighed, leaning forward to address the courtroom. "Ms. Harris," he said, his tone strained, "I have considered the evidence, or lack thereof, and the testimonies. While I believe that your behavior was not in line with what we expect in public spaces, I cannot ignore the insufficiencies in this case." Julia's heart raced, though she maintained her composure, her gaze locked on the judge's face. She could feel Robert's steady presence beside her, grounding her in this pivotal moment. Judge Langston continued, his voice wavering slightly. "Therefore, I am dismissing the charges. However, I urge you, Ms. Harris, to reflect on the value of civility and respect within our society." A surge of relief and joy filled the room as the words left his mouth. Though Judge Langston's tone was begrudging, the dismissal was a clear victory. Supporters in the courtroom broke into quiet applause, and Randall smiled, nodding respectfully at Julia. Julia took a deep breath, the weight of the ordeal lifting off her shoulders. She met the judge's gaze one final time, her expression unwavering. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply, her voice calm yet carrying a depth of conviction that spoke volumes. She had won, not just in the courtroom, but in her battle to uphold her dignity and self-respect. As Judge Langston banged his gavel, officially dismissing the charges, Julia and Robert stood, their hands entwined as they walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for them, people nodding and murmuring words of support and admiration. They had not only witnessed a courtroom drama, but had seen a powerful demonstration of resilience and justice. Outside, reporters swarmed around them, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. One reporter managed to ask Julia, "Ms. Harris, do you feel justice was served today?" Julia paused, looking directly into the camera. "Justice isn't just about winning a case," she said, her voice steady and composed. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. Today, I hope that others feel empowered to stand up, to speak out, and to demand the respect we all deserve." With those words, she turned and walked with Robert down the courthouse steps, their heads held high, their hands linked in unity. As they left the courthouse behind, Julia knew that this victory was more than a personal triumph. It was a message to everyone who had ever been made to feel small or invisible. They walked together into the future, carrying with them the lessons of strength, courage, and resilience, determined to continue their journey as advocates for justice and equality in a world that needed it more than ever. The dismissal of Julia Harris's case sent ripples through the community and beyond. What had started as a minor disturbance charge had grown into a powerful statement about justice, dignity, and the courage to stand against discrimination. News outlets, both local and national, picked up the story, painting Julia as a symbol of resilience and a voice for those who had long been marginalized. Journalists and community leaders hailed her victory as a call to action, sparking important conversations about bias in the justice system. Despite the victory in court, Julia's life didn't simply return to normal. She found herself thrust into the public eye, receiving messages of support and gratitude from strangers who felt empowered by her stand. Invitations for interviews poured in, requests for her to speak at community gatherings multiplied, and her inbox was flooded with heartfelt letters from people who had faced similar challenges. Each letter she read reminded her of the strength she had discovered within herself and the deep responsibility that came with it. Julia's phone buzzed with a message from her husband, Robert. He had been out of town for business meetings the past few days, working on a new community initiative that they had both been passionate about for months. He was always dedicated to social change, but since her trial, his resolve had grown stronger. His message read, "Meeting at 7 p.m. at the community center. Thought you might want to join. People would love to hear from you. Proud of you. Always." Julia smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Though the idea of public speaking still made her nervous, She knew this was a moment she couldn't ignore. There were people who needed to hear her story, and she wanted to give back to the community that had stood behind her during her most challenging days. It was time to use her voice in a new way, one that could inspire others to find their own strength. As evening approached, Julia prepared for the event. She chose a simple, elegant dress, one that conveyed both professionalism and approachability. Standing in front of the mirror, she took a deep breath, thinking of all the people who had been moved by her story. She was about to step into a role she had never anticipated, that of an advocate and leader in her community. Arriving at the community center, she was taken aback by the size of the crowd. Hundreds of people filled the hall, with others spilling into the corridors, all waiting to catch a glimpse of the woman who had dared to challenge injustice. Robert met her at the entrance, his face lighting up when he saw her. He wrapped her in a warm hug, whispering, "You're going to be incredible." Hand in hand, they walked into the hall, greeted by waves of applause and smiles from the audience. People of all ages and backgrounds had gathered: teachers, students, local activists, business owners, and even young families with children. Julia could feel the energy in the room, a mix of admiration and curiosity, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to hear what she would say. A respected community leader, Ms. Evelyn Johnson, stood at the front and introduced Julia. "Tonight, we are honored to welcome a woman who showed us that courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes speaks with quiet strength, and sometimes it stands firm in the face of deep injustice." Julia Harris reminds us all that justice is something we must actively pursue. Please give a warm welcome to our very own, Julia Harris. As Julia approached the podium, her nerves momentarily fluttered, but the sea of supportive faces steadied her. She took a deep breath, meeting the gaze of her husband, who stood a few feet away, his expression full of pride and encouragement. She began, her voice calm but powerful, resonating through the hall. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and thank you all for being here tonight," she said, pausing as the crowd's applause faded. "I stand here not as a hero, but as a woman who simply wanted to be treated with the respect every human being deserves. What I faced in that courtroom was not unique. Many of you here, and many beyond this room, have experienced something similar. But I hope that together, we can change that." The crowd listened intently, her words resonating deeply. Julia could see nods of understanding, expressions of empathy from those who had faced similar prejudices. For many, her story reflected their own unspoken struggles, their own quiet battles against systems that seemed intent on ignoring them. "What I learned," she continued, "is that justice is not something we can take for granted. It's something we must demand, something we must work for, not just for ourselves but for each other." Standing up in that courtroom wasn't easy, but I was reminded of the power of community. I was reminded that when we stand together, we create a force that no bias, no prejudice can overcome. A swell of applause filled the room, the audience visibly moved by her words. She took a moment, letting the energy sink in before speaking again. "When I was in that courtroom," she said, her voice softer but filled with conviction, "I thought about my family, my friends, and everyone who had ever felt silenced. I thought about the countless times people have had to swallow their dignity just to make it through the day. I thought about the times I, too, stayed silent. But that day, I decided I would no longer allow myself to be invisible." The crowd's applause was louder this time, some even rising from their seats. Julia felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of connection with the people around her. She had spent so much of her life feeling isolated in her struggles, yet now she saw a community united in a shared vision for equality and justice. "I want each of you to know," she said, her voice unwavering, "that you have the power to make a difference. Whether it's speaking up in a classroom, challenging bias in a workplace, or supporting a friend who's been wronged. Every act of courage, big or small, counts. And when we support each other, we create a network of resilience that nothing can break." Julia noticed a young woman in the front row, tears glistening in her eyes, nodding along as she spoke. Behind her, A father held his young daughter close, a look of pride on his face. Julia knew she wasn't just speaking to a crowd. She was speaking to individuals whose lives were touched by her story, individuals who saw themselves in her journey. Tonight, she concluded, I ask you to remember that our voices matter. That justice is not an abstract idea, but a right we must claim for ourselves and for each other. Let's commit to building a world where everyone, no matter who they are, can walk into a store, a school, or a courtroom and know that they will be treated with respect and dignity. Because that's the world we all deserve. The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that reverberated with gratitude and admiration. People cheered, some calling out her name, others raising their hands in solidarity. Julia felt a surge of emotion, humbled and strengthened by the response. She looked over at Robert, who was clapping with a proud smile, his eyes shining with love and respect. After her speech, she was surrounded by people eager to share their own stories, to thank her for her courage, to express how deeply her words had impacted them. She listened intently to each person, offering words of encouragement and gratitude. A young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. Ms. Harris, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I faced discrimination at my job, but I was always too afraid to speak up. Seeing you stand strong, it's given me the courage to make my voice heard. Thank you. Julia took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. You are stronger than you know, she said warmly. Never doubt the power of your voice. If you ever need support, remember that there are people here who will stand with you. Later that night, as they left the community center, Julia and Robert walked hand in hand, feeling the weight of the evening settle around them. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. You were amazing tonight, Robert said, his voice filled with pride. You inspired so many people. I don't think you realize how powerful your words were. Julia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. I didn't do it alone, Robert. You've been my strength through this whole journey. I couldn't have done it without you. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as they walked. We're a team, Julia. And tonight, you reminded me why I fell in love with you all those years ago. Your strength, your compassion, it's changed lives. As they reached their car, Julia turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the determination she felt deep within. This isn't the end, she said softly. There are so many more battles to fight, so many more voices to lift. I want to be part of that change, Robert. I want to keep standing up for those who feel invisible. Robert nodded, his expression serious. And I'll be right there beside you, every step of the way. In that quiet moment, beneath the stars, Julia felt a sense of peace and purpose she had never known before. Her journey was far from over, but with Robert by her side and the unwavering support of her community, she knew she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they drove home, the events of the day replayed in her mind. The standing ovation, the stories people had shared, the tears, the gratitude. She knew that her battle in the courtroom had been just the beginning. Now her mission was clear, to use her voice, her strength, and her experience to continue fighting for justice, to uplift those who felt powerless, and to help create a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could walk through life with dignity and respect. In the days following the community gathering, Julia's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. What began as a simple act of defiance in a courtroom had become a rallying point for change, with her story inspiring people far beyond her city. Emails and letters poured in from individuals who had been moved by her stand against injustice, each sharing their own experiences of discrimination and prejudice, each echoing her call for dignity and equality. But as the support grew, so did the weight of her new role. Julia was no longer just a woman who had fought a single battle. She had become a symbol of resilience and a beacon of hope for those who felt unseen. With Robert's encouragement and guidance, she decided to create something lasting out of her experience, a platform that would allow her to channel her newfound voice into meaningful change. After several conversations with her husband and close friends, Julia and Robert established the Empowerment and Justice Foundation, an organization dedicated to advocating for equal rights, raising awareness of racial bias in the justice system, and offering legal assistance to marginalized communities. The foundation's mission was clear: to create a world where every individual was treated with respect, dignity, and fairness, regardless of race or background. Their first project focused on an outreach program that visited schools, community centers, and workplaces to conduct workshops on equity and inclusion. Julia was especially passionate about the school visits, knowing firsthand the importance of reaching young minds early. She spent hours working with a team to create curriculum modules that emphasized empathy, respect, and understanding. Each lesson was designed to show students the impact of prejudice and to teach them the value of diversity. One afternoon, while preparing for a presentation, Julia received a call from Ms. Evelyn Johnson, the community leader who had introduced her at the gathering. Ms. Johnson sounded enthusiastic. "Julia, I've been speaking with the city council," she said, "and they're interested in partnering with your foundation to address systemic issues in our local courts. They want you to meet with the mayor and discuss potential reforms." Julia paused, surprised but deeply honored. The thought of her small act of courage rippling out to influence real change in the legal system was beyond what she had dreamed. "Thank you, Evelyn. I'm ready for this," she said, her voice filled with determination. When the day of the meeting arrived, Julia and Robert arrived at City Hall, where they were greeted by Mayor Samantha Walker, a progressive leader who had long been pushing for social justice reforms. Mayor Walker led them to a private conference room where members of the city council and representatives from local organizations sat waiting, their expressions a mixture of hope and anticipation. After introductions, Mayor Walker began the discussion, her tone warm yet serious. "Julia, I think I speak for everyone here when I say that your courage in the face of bias was a wake-up call. Many of us are aware of the systemic issues in our courts, but it's often difficult to initiate change without a catalyst. Your case has given us an opportunity to address these issues head-on." Julia nodded, feeling the responsibility of her new role settle over her. "Thank you, Mayor Walker," she replied. "I never intended for my story to reach this far, but now that it has, I'm committed to helping others. The injustice I faced was a reminder that our courts and communities still have a long way to go. I want to use my experience to ensure no one else has to feel as invisible as I did." Councilmember Linda Tran, a passionate advocate for legal reform, leaned forward, her eyes shining with determination. "We've been researching successful reform models from other cities," she said. "I believe with the right structure, we can implement changes that would make our courts more accountable and fair. But we need community voices, people like you, to make it resonate with the public." The meeting lasted for hours, with council members, Julia, and other community leaders brainstorming ideas. They discussed implementing bias training for judges and court officials, establishing a community advisory board to oversee the courts, and setting up a hotline for people to report incidents of discrimination. Julia felt invigorated, her mind brimming with possibilities for meaningful systemic change. By the end of the meeting, Mayor Walker summarized their action plan. "I propose we start with a pilot program in one of our court districts, focusing on transparency and community oversight. Julia, with your foundation's involvement, I believe we can set a powerful example for other cities." As Julia left City Hall with Robert by her side, a feeling of pride and purpose filled her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a legacy of justice for future generations. In the following weeks, Julia worked tirelessly. She coordinated with local leaders, set up educational programs, and led workshops on empathy and justice in schools and workplaces. Her days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and planning sessions. Robert was with her every step of the way, offering advice, handling the foundation's finances, and standing by her side at every public event. One evening, after a long day of work, Julia and Robert sat on their porch, enjoying the cool breeze and the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Julia leaned back, looking up at the stars, feeling both exhausted and deeply fulfilled. "I never thought I'd end up here," she admitted, a soft smile on her face. "I spent so many years just trying to keep my head down, not make waves. And now, here we are, building something I could have only dreamed of." Robert reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You've always had this strength, Julia. It was just waiting for the right moment to come out. And now you're giving so many people the courage to stand up for themselves." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Julia turned to him, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "You know, this whole journey has taught me something important. It's not just about standing up for yourself. It's about creating space for others to stand up too. We're all connected, and when one of us rises, we lift everyone around us." Robert nodded, his gaze warm and full of admiration. "And that's exactly what you're doing, Julia. You're lifting people up." The months that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. The Foundation's influence continued to grow, drawing the attention of national organizations and even lawmakers interested in partnering on broader reform initiatives. Julia's story was featured in magazines, her voice amplified in ways she had never anticipated. One day, she received an invitation to speak at a national conference on social justice and legal reform. She would be sharing the stage with prominent activists, leaders, and legal experts from around the country. Though the thought was intimidating, Julia accepted, knowing that every chance to share her story was a step toward the change she believed in. When the day of the conference arrived, she stood backstage, listening to the applause and energy in the auditorium. Her heart raced, but she took a deep breath, grounding herself in the purpose that had brought her this far. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Julia felt a surge of gratitude and strength, knowing that her journey had touched so many lives. She began her speech, her voice resonating with confidence and conviction. "I stand here today not as someone who sought the spotlight, but as someone who was called to action by circumstance. My story is just one of many, and my journey is far from over. But each step I take, each word I speak, is for the countless people who have felt silenced, who have faced injustice, and who deserve better. Together, we can build a world where every person's voice is heard, and where dignity and respect are not privileges, but rights for all." The applause was thunderous, and as Julia looked out over the crowd, she saw a sea of faces filled with hope, determination, and solidarity. In that moment, she knew that she had found her true calling. This was more than a fight for her own justice. It was a movement, a collective demand for change, a shared vision of a fair and just world. As she stepped down from the stage, people approached her with words of gratitude and admiration. Leaders from other communities invited her to work with them. Young activists asked for advice, and families shared stories of how her courage had inspired them. Julia felt overwhelmed but deeply fulfilled, knowing that her voice was part of something much larger than herself. That night, as she and Robert returned home, she reflected on her journey, from a quiet woman facing injustice in a courtroom to a powerful advocate for equality and dignity. The path had been unexpected, often difficult, but every step had been worth it. Sitting beside Robert, she looked out into the night, feeling a profound sense of purpose. "We're just getting started," she whispered, a smile on her face. Robert nodded, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "And I'll be with you every step of the way." Together, they looked forward, ready to face the challenges ahead, committed to building a legacy of justice, compassion, and empowerment for generations to come. Julia knew that the journey was long, but with the strength of her community, her family, and her own unwavering courage, she would continue to rise, lifting others with her, one step at a time.